We'll start with Helen Andrews on the far side there. Helen is the senior editor of the American Conservative and author, most recently, of Boomers, the men and women who promised freedom and delivered disaster. We have, next to her, Emma Waters, who's a research assistant at the Heritage Foundation's Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Life, Religion, and Family, and author most recently of a very interesting report on IVF and attack in human person. Next to Helen, we have Dr. Catherine Pakala, who's an associate professor of social research and economic thought at Catholic University of America, the Bush School there, and author most recently, and forthcoming, I guess, in March, of Hannah's Children, the women quietly defining the birth dearth, and it's coming out soon. She authored a lead essay of a symposium we published, I think back 2 months ago on the subject. And last but not least, we have Megan McArdle, who's a Washington Post columnist and author most recently of The Upside Down, Why Failing Well is the Key to Success. And as Sam mentioned, this is the first of hopefully many debate series here, conversation series. So if it fails, we'll hopefully learn from it and go on to the next one to improve. So with that, we're going to open up into a few questions, as I mentioned, and then go to the audience for Q&A. The first is to just go over some of the facts and ask what our thinkers think of them. So in the U.S., the birth rate has steadily declined so much as a whopping 23% from 2007 to 2022. On average, American women today have about 1.6 children, down from a post-World War II peak of 3 in 1950, and significantly below the so-called replacement rate of 2.1%. This is a global trend. 50% of countries worldwide are below the replacement rate. So to our panelists who have different views on this, what causes or contributes to this decline? Do you agree that this decline amounts to a crisis as it's framed here in our event? And why or why not? Who wants to jump in with that heavy question?
Wait, no, that sounded promising. Oh, okay, am I audible? Yeah. Terrific. Well, thank you to Young Voices for having me here. I did a panel like this for them last year on immigration, and I'm happy to be back again to talk about fertility, although joke's on them, I'm going to talk about immigration again. In all seriousness, I part ways from some of the pronatal right because I don't necessarily think that falling fertility rates are always and everywhere a problem. It is simply not the case that the population always has to be going up. Sometimes population declines can be good or appropriate or fine. However, if your society's fertility rates are falling sharply, that could be a blinking red light that something bad is going on. And it's not just people pursuing their preferences. And I think that's the case here. I think probably the reasons for the fertility decline are things like women being stuck in credential stamping education for too many years, more years than society needs for them to be. So needless prolonging of the education pipeline, mismatch in the number of women with college degrees and the number of men with college degrees, leading to a failure of those two groups to marry, and women postponing childbearing later in life. If falling fertility rates are a blinking red light indicating that the way families form and the way childbearing and life patterns are structured in our society is broken, then yes, definitely falling fertility is something we should be worried about. But to bring it back full circle to close my answer, the problem is not just that there are fewer people. Because if that were the problem, we could just say, oh, okay, add immigration, done, problem solved. We now have more people. But if the real problem is that something's broken about the way that we pair off and form families, which are, the number one source of meaning in most human lives, if that's the real problem, then just pouring immigration into the mix is not going to solve it. And actually, preview of future remarks, may be making the problem worse.
So I'm gonna offer it. Am I on? I'm not sure. No. Okay, I'm not.
I think you are.
Hello. Okay. So I will offer a libertarian statement against interest, which I think fewer people is a problem, actually.
And I think that's true on a number of levels. One is that more people is good. And I should say that, like, to the extent this is a problem, I am the problem. I am 50 years old and I have no children. It's not going to happen. That ship has sailed many years ago. And yet, look, more people is good. More people is more ideas. More people is more ways to do things. More people is more people you could be friends with. People are good. I just think people are naturally good, and that we should just generally want more of them. Not so many that we like poison the earth and we all die in an environmental holocaust. But short of that, more people generally better. Second, I will actually agree with Helen. I don't think immigration is the long-term solution to the problem. It is going to be part of the short-term solution to not having enough people to take care of the old people. It just has to at this point. Demographics is a very slow-moving crisis, and that wave is going to happen, and someone is going to have to be working in those nursing homes, and I think it's going to be immigrants. But birth rates in the donor countries are also falling precipitously, right? And the thing that people don't think about is that not just that releases a lot of the demographic pressure that say there is one farm, 4 boys, what do the extra 3 sons do? But it also means, look, when you're leaving a country, if you are one of 5 kids and 2 of them migrate, that leaves 3 kids at home to take care of mom when she gets older. If you are one of 1 kid, the migration decision is much different. And if you do migrate, you are apt to really want to bring mom with you. And then mom does not solve the problem, mom makes the problem worse. And so the third thing I would say is that our society is structured for growth. Things like government debt just inherently assume, and it doesn't matter how you fund it, retirement just assumes there are going to be more than 1 worker per retiree. It mathematically has to. And so when you alter that assumption, it creates a problem that we have promised something that most people don't understand, and they don't understand that this is not actually a matter of how we finance it, that it's not a matter of how there aren't enough defined benefit pensions, there aren't enough Social Security, there's literally just, is that me or someone else? There is literally just a physical problem of not enough bodies to contribute in. And that is an issue. The national debt, very easy to pay off if GDP is growing, very hard to pay off if it is not. And the last thing I'll say is the age structure of society matters. Old people are inherently more conservative, partly because they have less time for investments to pay off. If you are 50 and you found a successful company, you have a lot fewer years to enjoy that than if you are 30. But they're also more conservative temperamentally. We have a lot of evidence that, like, by far, extreme risk-taking is a thing that young men do, and that declines pretty much monotonically as they age. And so, optimal risk-taking is not in your 60s, it is in your 20s through mid to late 40s, when you kind of peak at the combination of experience and willingness to take risks. As society ages, you just have fewer of those people, and you have more people who will not let anything change, because they have made too many plans, they have laid too many investments that depend on everything staying the same, and that is a recipe for stasis. And so for all of those reasons, I actually think the literal just shortage of people is a huge issue for America and for the world. And I have a lot of thoughts about causes, but I've talked a lot, so I'm going to stop.
So I'm going to shift this now from the economic to the familial, and talk about how we certainly do have a fertility crisis on our hands. The number of children that are being born each year has continued to fall precipitously each year and is not recurring, even as some economic growth post-COVID is making its way back up. But ultimately, what we have here is not a fertility crisis as much as it is a marriage crisis. So we have fewer and fewer people getting married each year. So if you look at birth rates strictly within man-woman marriages, you actually see about 2 to 3 children on average, so above the 2.1 replacement rate that we're interested in. The decline in fertility that we're so concerned about here tonight is actually due to the number of men and women who will never get married, and therefore are far less likely to actually have the number of children that they need in order to sustain birth rates. So when we're talking about the fertility crisis, I really like to make a distinction between pronatalism, which wants more children. At best, right, they value children, they want to see more children born for all the reasons that have been shared here tonight. And perhaps on the worst end, pronatalism can oftentimes view children as an end in themselves. So as long as we get more children, it doesn't really matter how we get them, or if we get more people, right, it doesn't matter where they necessarily come from. I think that that line actually misses a fundamental part of this discussion, which is that we don't necessarily need, or we don't necessarily want more children for their own sake, but we want more married families with loving mothers and fathers who can raise those children, steward the children, and actually create and form not only productive members of society who can aid in our GDP and care for the aging population that we have, but also they can just form families of happy children where people actually delight in the life that they have with one another. And so when I think about the fertility crisis, I really like to make that distinction between what I'll call maybe pronatalism, children as an end in themselves, so any means necessary to get those children, and this pro-family approach that really advocates for more married husbands and wives having children within that bond. And again, when we see those families, we're actually seeing a lot of people have enough children for replacement rates. We're just not seeing enough marriages form. So I think that the real question here is, why aren't people getting married? And why, through those marriages, are we not actually having the children that many women say that they want to have and that we need for a productive society? And sort of the last thing I'll say before I pass this off to Catherine is, when we're talking about children, we're inherently talking about what people place their hope in, what people ultimately desire. So if you think about Judaism or the ancient Greeks, for example, they actually understood eternity through the procreation of children. And so they did not necessarily have a refined view of the afterlife, but they said, well, as long as I have children, they have children, and they have children, my name and my memory will live on through them. And that was really how we established this deeper, even transcendent understanding of what it means to be human, is through the procreation of children. And so that we live in a nation that has declining birth rates, graciously slide off there, that has declining birth rates means that there's actually something very broken in the way that we're thinking about the future, and something very broken in the way that we're thinking about what it means to be human.
Thank you. Okay, bring it up to rear. Let's see. Okay, so I think that I'm not going to spell out. I think I agree with most of the panelists about, just to some extent, whether this is a crisis. I'm just going to kind of skip back to like the way I would try to summarize. Is this okay? The way I would try to summarize the reason for what we're facing, what we're looking at. I don't know if I like to use the word crisis, but it's a kind of objective set of facts, which are at least a problem if you believe in funding the government in the way we've been doing it. So that, we could debate that. But if you want to keep having these programs, we won't be able to fund them. But I also believe people are good and ideas are good, and I also worry about anxiety and loneliness and those kinds of things, like smaller family sizes, fewer siblings, fewer cousins, and all of those things. So setting that aside, what is going on? And I guess I would like to say that kind of like Aristotle made this point, right? Thinking about just human rationality. Aristotle makes this point: you don't give up something to get absolutely nothing in return, or you don't give up something to be better in no respect at all. There's got to be some respect in which you're better. So that might be one way to kind of summarize in a quick single sentence kind of the way I see the rationality of the decision-making process. So having a child, it means giving up a lot of stuff. It means giving up a lot of time and a lot of like other things you could do. And so in previous times, what would you get in return? You would certainly get help around the home, help in family household production. Children are sort of net benefit to the household. You can think about that in the past. You get that in return. You might get support for your old age in return. So these are kind of like economic rationality reasons. Things you get in return. So those have obviously collapsed, right? And when we think about what you give up to have a child, that's increased dramatically. We think about sort of just generally speaking, kind of the inflection point in the middle of the 20th century. All of a sudden, women can do these other things. So we talk about how they desire to have children and get married, but they really desire to go to work and fulfill their sort of God-given talents. That's a good thing. We've got two good things in a collision course. Keep your eye on the ball of the collision course, because I'd like to say we're making too much of women's desires for children. A lot of people want to lose weight, and they don't lose weight. A lot of people want to run marathons, they don't run marathons. I don't know why the desires for children are something that should tell us that everybody's constrained and somehow like they're structurally prevented from having children. I would like to say that I think that when push comes to shove, women and households are balancing competing goods. It's really good to have a career, to pursue your education to its fullest. and participate in the labor market. It's really good to get married and have children. Those two things, unfortunately, happen to be in conflict. When push comes to shove, what we're seeing is what we're seeing. It's a kind of revealed preference. People don't want children enough to suppress a lifetime of those contributions. Can we fix that? I don't know. Should we try to fix that? I don't know. We'll talk about that later. But I think that's the way to think about this. We've got some really important things that you have to give up in order to have extra children. And I don't think people want to have children enough to give up those things.
Yeah, Megan.
So I think that is right, but I also think it's somewhat incomplete, not necessarily in the way that you think about it, but in the way, we're talking short here. I think I would point out is that childbearing, as I think all of us on this stage would probably say, is the good way to do it, which is there are two biological parents raising a child, that you don't have like sort of a series of guys going through who are not the father while the father's off making another family with 3 or 4 other women, which is a pattern of childbearing that you see, that like that's not the ideal way to do it. And if you're talking about deliberate childbearing, it's a two-person choice, and it's a coordination problem, and a bit of a collective action problem, right? How easy it is to have kids depends in part on how many people around you have kids. And if you are in a neighborhood that does not have a lot of children, it is inconvenient to have children there. If you are in a neighborhood that has a lot of children, it's a lot easier because there are people for your kids to play with, and there's a bunch of services around, and all of that stuff. If you're in a society that prioritizes childbearing, then when you are 28, your friends will have kids, and it will be fun to have kids with your friends. If all of your kids are still in grad school, it will not be fun to be the only person who can't go out while they are all like still kind of in that phase of life. And so I think we should, I think you can overweight the structural issues, but I think that people like Scott Winship, who I love, underweights that these are coordination equilibria, and that I think we're probably in a bad one right now. I don't know how we get to a good one. That's a harder problem, but
I don't disagree with that, but I think it's secondary to like what gets you into that coordination problem. How do you make the shift from everybody's having 3 or 4 kids to everybody's having 1.6?
Yeah. I'm just really, really not satisfied with the position that Catherine just outlined, which is that we need to respect people's preferences. Just like women have a revealed preference for not actually losing the weight that they want to, they have a revealed preference for not having kids. Libertarians talk a lot about, the reason fertility is declining is because the opportunity cost of raising kids has gone up. And what they mean by that is, craft beer bars have gotten really good. It's so much fun to spend nights out these days. That's just really unsatisfying to me. There are a lot of times in deep policy discussions here in DC when I feel quite outclassed because, I think, don't look at me, I was an English major. I don't know anything. But this is one instance where being an English major actually helps out. Of the first 500 or 1,000 novels ever published in the English language, 99% of them are about young people deciding who to marry. And the reason why that's true is because young people, everybody knows, are really, really bad at making serious decisions about marriage, about fertility, about their future life path. It's really kind of stupid that your happiness at 45 is going to be determined in large part by a decision you made when you were in your early 20s, when everybody's really dumb. But that's true. The decision of who to marry is a number one factor in how happy you are later on. So it has been, my bottom line point is that it has been recognized by every civilization in history that young people are really bad at making decisions about family formation, who to marry, and what's going to make them happy when they're older. So we have a duty or a responsibility as older people to shape their decision making. So young people and family is one area where I don't think we can just say, if your preference is to go out for tapas every night instead, I guess whatever makes you happy.
So that's not what I said. What I said was that what we're seeing is a collapse of demand for children. What to do about it is a separate question. But what I said is that I think that's exactly what we're seeing, is we're seeing people with very deeply conflicting preferences. And they don't discover until after it's too late that actually the choices they made make that difficult to do.
It's like the gods are interfering. I think we should also keep in mind, though, I mean, I don't think that this story is entirely wrong in the sense that I actually think, like, look, tapas are great. I love tapas. But also that it's possible to have good short-term decisions that are bad long-term decisions. And so I think you can kind of square that circle a little bit by saying, like, look, society helps young people through that because, like, they haven't been 45 and they don't really know what they're going to want. So we just kind of encourage them to do stuff that's going to pay off when they're 45. But that said, we should also point out that we are actually talking about two completely different sets of people. There are two fertility crises, not one. There is people like us who are delaying childbearing into their 30s and sometimes their 40s because they are attempting to establish high like what Claudia Golden, the economist, calls these hungry jobs. That you have to get tenure before you have kids or you can try stopping the tenure clock, but it doesn't really work, or you are trying to get a Pulitzer or whatever it is you're trying to do that is somewhat incompatible with childbearing. It takes a lot of kind of practice and experience. And then there are people who are younger and who are not having kids because they cannot find someone who is minimally responsible to have kids with. And those are actually two completely different problems. And the one problem is actually the much less common problem, but it's the one that we talk about because that's the problem we have. And I think probably everyone on this stage has had, or certainly many people in this room, have had the tragic conversations with friends who are like, that was my 4th round of IVF, we were out of money, and we're done. And like, that is a really common thing to happen to people like us. It's not really a common thing to happen if you're growing up in a trailer park in Missoula. The common thing that happens there is that like your boyfriend beats you and leaves you, and then you really don't want to have kids anymore because are you going to get stuck with that? And I don't know how to solve that problem at all. This problem seems like it might be somewhat amenable to solutions, which is another reason I think we talk about it more.
I just want to pull us back to like the 1950s and the 1960s for 1 second. When the birth control pill was approved, married women rushed to have it. It diffused throughout American society in like under 5 years. If the desire to have like huge families or even like above normal families was so prevalent, if that desire was so prevalent, we wouldn't have seen that occur. Basically, the minute you have good, effective contraception, everybody uses it. And what we did is we switched from a culture in which you got married and started having kids because that's just what you did, and then you stopped. You turned that off at some point. After the pill, you flip to a situation where when people get married, they don't have their first baby immediately. They get married and they wait around and see when the right time to have a child is. And in that regime change, you basically change to below replacement fertility. So while I don't disagree with anything you just said, to focus entirely on young people getting married and then kind of like the dumb things that they think about when they're young, I'm not convinced that the demand for sort of above replacement fertility is something we can simply take for granted.
Yeah, so as we're talking about preferences here and how preferences have changed, certainly the introduction of the pill and contraception, I think, was a radical break in how we understand families as we understand childbearing in the United States. But I think I really just want to push back against the idea that these preferences, not necessarily to you, Catherine, but generally, that these preferences have just organically developed over time, when in fact there's been a rather concerted effort since the 1970s and even before to actually radically shape childbearing in the United States. So if we think back to Margaret Sanger and the creation of the pill, right? The creation of contraception was specifically targeted towards people that we did not want to have too many children. There was the eugenic desire to control particular populations. And so they framed it as control over your fertility or female empowerment, but ultimately the goal was that there would be some women having children and some women having far fewer children. And then you get to the 1970s, and you have Richard Nixon's administration. And in his administration, he has something called the Population and American Fertility Commission. So John D. Rockefeller III, related to the Rockefellers of New York City, was the chairman of this commission. He had read The Population Bomb, was convinced that we were overpopulating and running ourselves into disaster, and his solution was to take women from having an average of 3 to 5 children, or really an average of 5 children at the time, and bring that number down to what if women only had 3 or 4 children? Like, if we can really get to that point, then we've solved the fertility crisis, which in this conversation just seems like the ideal zone to be in, right? Like, oh no, women, too many children around. but he really felt that we needed to bring down the rate of, I lost my word. Oh, there we go. The rate of children that were being born. So through this commission on fertility and the American future, he recommended a list of rather insane but ultimately successful policies. So he said, first and foremost, we need an equal rights amendment, something that makes women equal in every area of society so that they can pursue their career without any sort of limitations whatsoever. It would also give them an absolute right to abortion, which was his second tenet, that he wanted to see abortion available to married women and unmarried women alike. And notably, these results came out in the early 70s before Roe v. Wade was decided. And this is around the population bomb craze, so there's a lot of questions about what was really shaping the justice's decision at that moment. Third, he said we need contraception access for everyone, married women and unmarried women alike. They should have the right to control their fertility. This should be a major tenet that we support. Fourth, he said that we need to remove home economic classes from high schools. So we no longer need to separate the boys from the girls and teach men how to fix things in the house and how to keep their car running and how to mow the lawn. And women no longer need to learn how to cook good meals and care for children. But instead, let's just get rid of that altogether and train them to be good careers, good people in education. And then the fifth and final recommendation that he had here in the early 70s was that we needed to encourage women to pursue higher education, which we're in favor of, right? But think about the reasons he's encouraging this. And we need to encourage them to pursue full-time careers. And in pursuing higher education and pursuing full-time careers, women would be more likely to delay marriage, delay childbearing, and therefore have fewer children. And all this is spelled out in a report that he published in 1971. And so this is covered in Life magazine and a few other places about the crucial math of motherhood. But I think it's just important to keep in mind, right, that all of those goals, except for the passage of the AIER, have been achieved through federal and state policy systematically since then. And so to say that we've gotten to this place of low fertility just based on changing preferences, I think it's a little simplistic, but we need to recognize that there's actually been a very targeted move by policymakers and by certain elites to radically shape the way that women in particular think about the home, think about their career, and think about what meaning in life, or what things will really bring the most meaning in life. And that, for the most part, has really influenced where we've come today and has given itself to this depressed view of fertility.
Great. So we have at least 3 levels of observation here, right? Like, you got the macro, right? It's maybe the kids are freaking out about climate change, right? Or the culture's changing. This is sort of like the least quantifiable, right? You have the middle level. You got like marriage, immigration, different, maybe the college industrial complex, right? Policy level, let's say. And then you have this sort of micro level, individual choices. And the explanations, the comments that you all have given so far have ranged across those 3. But to somebody with somewhat of a libertarian disposition here, this is, you can hear this conversation and think, well, if there are this many darn factors, right, in why this, let's say, crisis or decline is happening, where does that leave us if we decide we want to address it? And so the question there is, where do you look, if you agree that this is a problem on some level, where do you look at the place to address the problem, right? Is it federal policy? Is it state policy? Is it, the great civic infrastructure of the United States, right? Where do you gravitate across those different layers? Because the comments and the writing on this kind of always toggle between those, and it kind of leads to people talking past one another when it comes to actual solutions, if indeed we agree there is a solution to be had. So let's get quick answers to that, and then maybe start taking some audience Q&A. Is that part of the plan? So let's see, who wants to venture first the solution to the fertility crisis?
Start a mega church. Somebody here go out and start a mega church. Yeah.
So I would be in favor of this unless you looked at until you look at all the mega churches in DC. They're filled with a bunch of 20s and 30s Christians, and none of them are getting married. This is the same as any mega church city.
This is a sheltered workshop for nerds. It might not be
decisions on the basis of DC. This is like psychology reasoning from college students.
All mega churches function like DC. You're not going to get married.
Do I get a prize if I'm the first person to mention Hungary?
Yeah.
No, actually, I want to bash Hungary. hearing about it. I'm sick of hearing about Hungary. I'm sorry. They're lovely people. Our politics editor, Bradley Devlin, at my magazine, The American Conservative, was smart enough to bring copies of the most recent issue, which are on those tables. So pick it up, read it. It's what we do. But there's an article in there about not Hungary, but Romania. Romania, which is a country, as you may know, adjacent to Hungary. They also had a lot of the same demographic problems that Eastern European countries did. They had collapsing fertility rates and also massive emigration. As soon as the borders opened, everybody fled to Paris and London. Well, guess what? Romania's population is going back in the upward direction. A lot of the people who fled are returning to have their own kids. Romania has a higher fertility rate than Hungary, and they didn't even do anything. Oh, fantastic. That's a wonderful country, absolutely beautiful. And they didn't do it through having a lot of weird, fiddly, your fifth kid and all your fees or taxes are free stuff, which I guess is cute, whatever. But they did it just by becoming more prosperous. Their economy's growing, it's doing better. And actually, in some ways, declining population can be a self-correcting problem. Because the reason a lot of the people who left are coming back is because there's less competition, so they see a wide open road for their own ambitions, for the ambitions of their kids. So things are kind of following their natural path. So I would not put my hope in fiddly Hungarian tax credity things. If you get your general country on a good, prosperous path, the good things will follow.
Yeah, if pronatal policies like, we are subsidizing your fifth child and beyond, if that stuff works, it works on a very low margin, right? You are making very marginal changes in your birth rate. It's interesting to look at Israel, which appears to, and if you talk to Israelis, they'll be like, well, we just give IVF to everyone, which is true. They're like, you're a 58-year-old single mom, let's do it, right? Like they really want you to have kids, but it's not really what's going on, it's cultural. And it's about how the culture feels about kids, and again, about some of these collective action things where the more kids there are, the easier it is to have more kids. Look, I think housing is actually pronatal policy in a big way. And if you look at apartment, I grew up in an apartment. And I grew up in an apartment that was built before World War II, and it was built for a family and a maid, because it's pre-war New York. But it's built in a building that is built for families. It was intended that way. It does not have a teeny tiny living room and the assumption that everyone needs the ability to watch television in their bedroom, right? And we don't build those apartments. Every apartment, to a first approximation, every apartment that is built today is built on the assumption that it will be shared by a young childless couple or a single person. Remote work actually gives us a chance to do some of this, to open up land for development, but also places that already have lots of houses no one's living in right now. So I think there are things like that, right? If you make it expensive to form a family and buy a house, fewer people will form a family and buy a house. And I do think that that is part of the contribution. I agree that it's not all of it, right? This is happening everywhere. You can blame US culture, fine, that's some of it, but that's not why birth rates are falling in Iran. And it is true that people are choosing this, but I also think that ultimately this is unsustainable. Now, the libertarian solution, other than doing things like removing active barriers to building housing that families could live in, might just be we just wait, and eventually the Orthodox and the Mormons and the Amish will be the only people left, and then our birth rates will be very high again. But one way or the other, this is gonna be resolved. The question is, for me, is what sorts of barriers can we remove that are major barriers, like housing, things like car seat regulations, which is a real meaningful reason that people don't have their kids, because they would have to buy a huge car because they have to have their kid in a car seat until he's ready to take the SAT. And we could change that because basically all of the benefit of a car seat is in the first 2 years of life. It's the safety benefit after that is really very marginal and I think outweighed by the fact that people are not having kids. We could do stuff like that. Remove those barriers. I'm not against trying fiddly tax cuts if you want, but it's not going to do anything. The main thing that does something is create conditions where it is pleasing and easy to have children. And most American cities do not look like that right now.
Besides starting mega churches, so I'll put my proposals in 3 categories, right? The first one sounds a lot like what Megan's talking about, just creating the conditions economic growth, I want to say sound money. I mean, we never talk about this, not as much as we should, right? But so sound money as part of what the recipe for economic growth on those conditions. The second thing is, like, think about where people's values are formed. So if I'm at least partially right that there's a collapse of demand or that people don't want children enough, like, where does that come from? And I mean, part of my research suggests it comes very deeply from both biblical religious values. So what are we doing to churches? Oh, we're telling them they can't do their thing. There's a million ways that Yeshiva University is offending everybody, and every other, like the Little Sisters of the Poor, we're out on this crusade about like rights in the Constitution, but we're not even thinking about that crusade as being somehow like anti-natalist, but I think that it is. And I think that there's very specific content of very specific religious traditions talks about children as blessings, and it bolsters demand for children. And in many of those types of communities, these are minority communities within Mormonism. Today it's not the majority Mormons, it's minority Mormons, minority Catholics, it's minority Baptists, minority religious communities that are biblical all over the country. So making it easier for those communities to shape values. How do churches shape values? They shape values through, like, sort of the care of the poor that they sort of normally do. The main way religions and religious communities shape values is through education. So you could cut the number of children in public schools in half tomorrow. You'd probably see a little bit of a baby boom in about 15 years. That's pretty soon. I mean, you don't have to wait that long. So why is that so hard? It would be a problem if we looked around and thought, gee, there's no religious people out there that want to run schools. It's too bad they can't get access to funding, right? So we just free that up. Like, why is that so difficult? So education policies, your family policy, your economic policies, your family policy. The third thing is that, there's this little tiny bit of research that no mainstream economists want to look at, but it's there and it's pretty solid, which is reconsider some of the fiscal externalities, right? So pension programs of the kind that we think that are sort of normal, we take them for granted since World War II, do create a disincentive for the individual household to have children. Italian economists sort of estimate that somewhere between a half and 3/4 of the decline in household demand for children in Italy could probably be attributed to the expansion of the Italian pension program. What do I mean? Well, look, at some point, if you don't have to have any kids and you're still supported in your old age, well, why would you be the schmuck that contributes the fourth child? So we just reconsider this. So the point there would be, we don't have to dismantle the entire Social Security system, but at the moment, we only reward years working. We don't reward how many children you had. And that would be a pretty simple tweak, and there are some proposals out there to do that. So those are my 3 things. Right? I think the last thing, the same thing about it's not going to make a huge difference, but it's the kind of thing we should look at.
Also, Tradwife TikTok. We need more subsidized Tradwife TikTok.
Okay, well, this goes great into mine. So I have 2 positives and then a negative. So the first positive, which is the individual and cultural levels, I think it's actually very harmful to speak about cultural trends unless you're willing to apply them to yourself and talk about what you yourself are actually contributing to the culture. And so first, Tim Carney has a book coming out called Family Unfriendly. And he really makes the argument that our society is structured in such a way as to be unfriendly to children, to make it difficult or burdensome to bring them around you. Now, my solution, I have an 11-month-old daughter. She's at home with a babysitter right now. And frankly, the only reason she's not here right now is because how disgusting these floors are. And there is no way I would let her hands touch them and not come home with some disease, as much as we love being at last call. But our solution, my husband and my solution, is just to bring her everywhere. She has made a debut at most restaurants in DC and is thankfully well behaved, but has sat at tables at very nice restaurants. She's been to not crazy bars, but a couple of bars in her 11 months of life. I've taken her to work events with me when it's appropriate. We bring her to church, we bring her to hangouts. We make having a child a natural part of our life. And there are very few times you'll actually see us without her with us. Not because we don't have babysitters, we love babysitters and all the help that we have, but because my husband and I really want to normalize how wonderful children are. That they're actually just a delight, that they add to the conversation, that they add to the experience that we're having with friends, that they're just gosh darn adorable. And they make this little baby talk sound, and all the adults just hush and they're like, wow, this child has spoken. And it's this incredible thing of just delight and wonder that it really brings to any sort of environment that we've been in. And I think that enables us to remember, one, what the things are that are most important in life, and really normalize having children. That this is not something that you have to wait until you're established in your career. Sort of the cornerstone versus capstone model that Helen has talked so much about, that marriage and children should be the cornerstone of your life, that should be what you build your life upon, not the capstone that you pursue. And so everything else that I do comes from this place of being married and being a mother. So the career that I pursue comes through that lens. The friendships that I pursue, the things that I do, all really find their energy and find their delight from those primary relationships. So I think like the cultural level of like normalize having children and kind of bring them everywhere. My husband and I joke that we're increasing the birth rate just by bringing her around. And then occasionally friends are like, well, I don't know, kids don't seem that bad. And they start having kids, and it's amazing. And we love seeing that. So that's the cultural level that I think is really important, is just normalizing and encouraging children. And where children aren't naturally welcome, you just sort of make them welcome, and you make that a priority. And obviously for a lot of us, that means just like start going on lots of dates and prioritize marriage. And then once you've done that thing, prioritize children. And really just like, don't let the culture dictate that, you dictate it yourself. The second would be the governmental policies. And I think one thing here is I concur with Helen that tax credits and any sort of like fiddling with our economy is not going to be the ultimate solution here. And there are certainly a lot of interesting conversations that are happening in this space. I'm personally very in favor of a child tax credit. It gives more money to married parents, and we should do whatever we can to make our tax policies not only have fewer marriage penalties, but then we should find ways to actually give more benefits to married couples. And so think of like the scriptural idea of like where your money is, there your heart will be also, and where we're willing to invest our finances actually reflects where we invest our own values. But beyond that, think about just major level things. Think about government grants, government messaging, the sort of expectations we set through our national government. Think about the rise of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and wokeness, and ESG. The government isn't in all cases actually mandating that these businesses have these sorts of priorities, right? But there is an expectation that if you have them, you will somehow get favorable outcomes from that. Maybe you'll be more prioritized for a government grant. Maybe you're going to rank better on some sort of best business in the United States ranking, right? Whatever the case is. But I think we need to trade those things out, which are antithetical to the family, antithetical to a free and flourishing society. And then anytime we can incentivize having children and getting married, we should do that. Whether it's in messaging, whether it's in saying like, hey, whatever businesses provide the most supportive environment for mothers to not only work, but also have the flexibility that they desire to have children and to be with those children, we want to prioritize that. And really using the government to put forward like a positive message for children that sets the standard for what we expect to see. The third, final, and brief thing that I think we should absolutely not to do, because this is actually contrary to the sort of society that we want to see, is we don't want to rely on reproductive technologies to solve our fertility crisis. So this includes things like in vitro fertilization or surrogacy and the many variations that come from that. If you look at Israel, at China, at Hungary, at Spain, and almost many major countries, you see that they have state-funded coverage for IVF. And in many cases, that's in an explicit response to try to restore their birth rates. Israel's birth rates, while they're still the highest, are actually declining right now. And so you see these countries who, in their delight to have more children and their desire to have more children, have used modern technologies to try to incentivize and enable that where it hasn't naturally happened in a person's life. And in each of those scenarios, we haven't actually seen a meaningful increase in birth rates. And in fact, they've either stayed about the same or continued to decline, depending on what year you're looking at. And so when it comes to the United States, and again, thinking about the cultural perspectives, my primary concern is that in encouraging things like widespread access to IVF or surrogacy, we're actually creating the very problem that we're trying to solve. These technologies encourage women to, again, delay marriage, delay childbearing. And don't worry, we have a technology to fix this. Except the technology doesn't actually do that. And perhaps the way we approach these technologies and the way they shape our view of children actually reinforces the very mindset that's led to this fertility crisis, which is this atomized individual society who is looking to have children on their own terms in the way that's most convenient, but maybe isn't actually embracing just a culture that is pro-family and pro-child broadly. So I'm very hesitant about these technologies, and so for all the things I think for the cultural and like positive messaging side, I have just as much hesitation towards these artificial means of trying to overcome it, either through the government or just through private business.
Excellent. So if you're comfortable shouting, raise your hand and we can call on some folks for questions. If not, shuffle on up. And meanwhile, everyone else should feel free to keep drinking. We have the open still. So yes, right here.
Yeah. So you mentioned, I think several panelists mentioned earlier that there are positive externalities or positive kind of considerations that people should make when they're considering pronatalism, when they're considering having more children. You guys mentioned, marriage leading to maybe higher income or higher educational attainment. Many of those factors are more. This is very robust scientific results that they're more determined by genetics, that they're more determined by hereditary factors than by environmental factors, something like marriage. So, do you think that this should be a consideration when making pronatalist policies, particularly in the case of something that's trying to focus on income or focus on educational attainment or something other secondary factors?
I'm not sure what that means, right? I have an above average chance of getting the tip off in basketball, but that wasn't useful until 100 years ago. I guess 50 for women, I don't know, 50 or 80 for women's basketball, right? It is true that this is all genetics, 100%. 6'2", and some environment, nutritionally, I would not have gotten this fall in the Paleolithic. But the environment is that now basketball exists. I have ADHD, which was not a benefit until blogging was invented, and now I have a career as a journalist. And so I think, yes, people who are educated are more likely to have kids who are good at education for a variety of reasons, but ultimately how we structure the educational system and how we structure work and how we structure culture to treat that educational system, right? We could, for example, have a cultural script that says, you know what, after you've gotten a basic education, you should be kind of doing some less demanding stuff. Well, you pop those kids out now while you're young and you can chase them after them, and then at 25 you go to grad school. Now, I actually think that that's probably not the right way to do it. It basically, you maximize your chances of being happy if you marry after 25, but there's no added benefit after the age of 25. It's just basically wait till you're 25, then pick someone. So you probably shouldn't do it that way, but you could have a variant of that, right? And that would still, people who are better at math would be more likely to become engineers in any system, but there's a lot of variation within how that system works and whether it is pronatal or not.
I would just want to add that although I offered 3 types of things that I thought would be useful, none of the 3 was an explicitly, I would say, direct policy incentive to have children. So I don't really believe that that's a good idea. I think that we can't even entertain, I don't believe it's a good idea because it won't work. So first of all, it just won't even work, right? But I think it's a really worrisome idea because I think if you kind of grant that the state has the authority to kind of regulate births, that's what that is, right? You kind of add a target. I don't see how you avoid that the state also has the ability to sort of discourage births, right? Through cultural messaging produced by the state. We call that propaganda. I just think this should not be the concern of the state to kind of aim at a target birth rate. I think it definitely can be the concern of the state to sort of aim at the types of conditions in which people can flourish and have children. So I specifically didn't want to mention those things. I don't think they won't work, and I don't think I think they're ethically suspect. We should be worried about them.
All right, Robert.
Thank you. I guess my question is mostly for Ms. McArdle, but I guess anyone can answer. A few of you have expressed the skepticism that failing these policies that sort of try to tweak things on the margins. And then right after saying that, Ms. McArdle, you brought up car seat regulations, which to me seem about as fiddly as you can get. I mean, this is right. Car seat regulations. I know the study you're referring to, but that's a really minor issue. Or changing zoning laws or things like that. So I guess my question for any of you is, how can it be that on the one hand, fiddling in the pro-regulatory direction will just have marginal effects, can't really do anything, but also somehow fiddling in the anti-regulatory direction is this really effective solution, and if we just tweak the zoning laws, we'll start having kids.
Well, I don't know that it's like super effective, but there is a difference between fiddling in a way where like I'm going to take money from someone who could have done something with that money that they will now not do. I'm going to introduce a regulation that makes it hard for them to do something they want to do. Just being like, I have this stupid car seat regulation that in fact is not making children safer, and also as a side effect is somewhat even slightly discouraging people to have children. Well, again, not making the babies safer. And I say, this is free. I could fiddle, like it's basically free violin music for the rest of social life. Similarly, like housing policy, we should just have better housing policy because it's better. And it's nice, like added bonus, we're making it easier for people to have kids. We should not do that simply because it's pronatalism. We should do a good thing. Like, there may be interventions on the margin, right? Okay, so say I'm on the margin about the child tax credit. How important is it to reduce child poverty versus am I affecting incentives to work? Right? I'm not getting into that brighter patch. But having decided I know what those weights are, maybe I say, but aha. I also maybe have this little added natalist effect, and that tips the balance. That's fine. But the stuff where I'm like, I'm going to spend an enormous amount of effort increasing like the number of people who have a fifth child by 400 every third year. Like this is not, the juice is not worth the squeeze.
Well, but this is the unfortunate part of the conversation is we're not debating about child 4 to 5, we're debating about child 0 to 1 or child 1 to 2, right? Like we're actually like at the very bottom of this discussion of what we can get at. And I think that Robert's question is on the point. It has a very good point to it, in that we can't only say that policies have a negative effect on our childbearing and not also recognize that we can have policies that actually do encourage these things. It is an open question, though, in what way they encourage them. So on the one hand, in family policy studies, you're going to read many accounts, and I certainly knew examples of this growing up, where people didn't get married because in getting married, they would actually get less assistance from the government that would hurt their family, so it was actually more financially beneficial for them to cohabitate with the children they had together, the children they had with other people, than to get married and lose out on that money. That is something that should absolutely not be present in any of our laws, right? So like, we don't want those negative barriers. At the same time, I barely understand how to do my taxes, and I assume that most people are probably in that same place. And so how many people are necessarily like sitting down to like calculate how much they are getting in these decisions? I think it's an open question, especially as you're dealing with like middle and low income families. But again, to sort of reiterate the point I had last time, I still think though that the policies we have in place do shape the values of a given nation, right? Like the law is a teacher. There's no such thing as moral neutrality when it comes to the laws in place. And so I think whatever direction our policies are leaning toward, whether they're leaning toward supporting and encouraging families, be it through more available housing, ensuring that our housing costs actually match how much we're making, and right now housing costs are about double of what income has progressed to, which is a huge problem. I think the direction they lean is going to, on some fundamental level, shape the sort of values that we have and the approach that we have to children. And we should think creatively about what are even the small things we can do, federal, state, and local, to encourage and show that children are a priority and that we want to enable that. First, by getting out of the way. Second, by doing what we can to encourage it.
Quick class word.
Okay, quick class word. All right. With all due respect to my good friend from the Heritage Foundation, this is a policy invariant problem, at least as far as we can see the variation in policies around the world. It's not to say that there aren't policies we haven't thought of yet, but we need to think about things that aren't policies, because at least at the moment, this is policy invariant. Places that don't drive cars have this problem. Places where there aren't car seats as an issue have this problem. So it's really important not to sort of get caught in like, well, the fun of crafting some kind of whatever we want to call it, fiddling type of policy. This is a policy invariant problem. So what are the non-policy things we can do to better this?
Yeah, I think that's broadly right. Look, I think I think we should remove the barriers to being married if you're getting various government benefits, because that's a good thing to do. And it is stupid to keep people from getting married in order to keep qualifying for Medicaid, right? But we should just do that because it's a good thing to do. And I think broadly, again, maybe little fiddles move it a little bit, but it's none of it is really enough to make a serious dent in this issue.
We have to call it here for now. We're leaving a lot of things unresolved. Great topics like dating apps and spermageddon for another time. But for now, we'll pause. Thank our panelists for a wonderful conversation. And we have some announcements on Young Voices from Emma here.
They're not announcements, but just the spiel. Guys, thank you so much for coming. Obviously, thank you to all of our panels. Can we get one more round of applause for them? Yeah, they're awesome. If you don't know Young Voices, we're a network and a talent agency for young people under 35. Sorry if you're not under 35. It's not we don't value you. We just don't work with you. We are a talent agency for people who want to get into commentary broadly. If you're a writer or somebody who's interested in just generally opinion, we love to connect people. We love to publish people. We are great at doing it. If you want more information about it, please let me know, or my colleague Casey Goodman back there. Young Voices is we know what we're doing, and if getting into commentary is something you're interested in, please let us know. It's free, which is nice. Love free stuff. Also, we have events like this with awesome panelists, as you all have heard, and we'd love to get to know you and figure out what it is you'd like to write about or talk about, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, great to have you here. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.